Recently, it was announced that the European Union has fined Google, I think it was 3 billion euros or something like that. Sounds like a gigantic amount, but actually it's nothing compared to Google's profits and turnover. So Google can merely pay that and continue on its way. So you cannot have national or even regional effective antitrust enforcement against these gigantic global corporations. You really have to look at it globally. So until we have global antitrust and global agreement on data protection, how can you negotiate free flow of data? It doesn't make any sense.
It's The Real News. I'm Lynn Fries. We're continuing our discussion with Internet governance expert Richard Hill. Richard Hill is president of the Association for Proper Internet Governance and a former senior official at the International Telecommunications Union. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you.
Let's pick up where we left off in part one. Your concluding point was that there should be no discussion of free flow of data at the World Trade Organization until certain preconditions are met, notably global agreement on antitrust regulation and on data privacy protections. Talk now about the background to this. Talk more about this US-led push.
The US has long taken the view that data should flow freely around the world and anybody should be free to connect. Those who remember Clinton, back when she was Secretary of State, may recall that she had an initiative on freedom to connect. Now, notice that's very interesting. It's not the right to connect, because the right to connect would imply that you get to do it at an affordable price, right? If you have the right to have something, you have to be able to afford it. It's freedom to connect. So, well, if you have enough money or personal data that's of value to us, then you're allowed to connect. Otherwise, we don't really care. And that agenda really is, again, a U.S. corporate agenda. As many people know, of course, the Silicon Valley types, Google and those people, were in pretty good terms with the Clinton administration and then also the Obama administration. That's no longer the case. We'll see what's going to happen now. But anyway, they were pushing that agenda because that's their business model. Their business model is they give you a service which is quote unquote free in exchange for your providing personal data. Then they use that personal data to create targeted advertising, which makes a lot of money for them. And as most people know, these companies are wildly profitable. We've never seen companies that are that profitable anywhere in the world. And basically, they're doing it by providing services which are valuable, but they're much less valuable than the personal data that we are providing. So my personal data is not worth very much, but combined with everybody else's personal data, it's worth a great deal of money. And the service they provide is nowhere near as valuable as the data they're receiving, which is why they're having such high profits. So basically, their model is they want to continue to do that, and they view data localization as a severe threat to that, and also privacy regulation. They haven't publicly come out too strongly against the European Global Data Protection Regulation, but I know they're worried about it. They have started to take measures to minimize its effects. And even I've seen some internal industry briefings basically where they're saying this is a bad thing and we want to make sure it doesn't happen elsewhere in the world.
Comment on how artificial intelligence fits into all this and relations between the US and China.
Much of modern artificial intelligence is actually based on massive data analysis and therefore on massive data collection. In China right now, there's no data privacy laws. So Chinese companies, they have a base of about 1 billion people on which they can collect data, which is a pretty big base. And the US companies don't have that base. And now they're getting worried because with the European global data protection regulation, it looks like they might lose control, or at least have less control over a significant portion of the European data, which is a large population. I forget exactly now, but it's like more than 300 million. It's actually bigger than the US population. So suddenly, US companies will not have access to as much data as the Chinese companies. And in the end, in long term, that might be a disadvantage for them, which is again why they're pushing for this free flow of data.
Give a concrete example of how private data is going to become extremely important.
Let's take the case of traffic flows in a city. And let's say that in some city, there's a dominant private ride-sharing operator, let's suppose Uber for the sake of convenience. They're going to have a lot of data about the traffic flows in the city. Now, that data is actually generated by us, the citizens who are taking those rides throughout the city. Now, when it comes to urban planning, or when it comes to creating an artificial intelligence system that will monitor the traffic lights and facilitate the traffic flows and so on, who is going to own all that data? Should it be Uber because they're the people who collected it? Or should it be us, the citizens, because we're the ones who generated it and properly, are the owners of the data because it's our data? So it's not just a question of the individual ownership of data, me as a citizen, but it's also the question of the collective ownership of a bunch of citizens. And this becomes particularly important when you consider artificial intelligence. Much of modern artificial intelligence, for example, the algorithms and programs and stuff that's used to create self-driving cars, is actually based not on some clever people figuring out how to do it, but on brute force analysis of a lot of data. You put a lot of sensors in the car and you drive it around a lot with a human and you collect all the data from the sensors and you see what the human did and then you create algorithms that emulate that. So when they see the same data pattern, they will act the same way the human did. So a lot of artificial intelligence is actually based on the data. Without the data, you wouldn't have artificial intelligence. So the question becomes, well, who gets to own the value added of that artificial intelligence? When all these self-driving cars and trucks replace all those truck drivers and all those cab drivers and even us as people, who gets the value added from that? Who gets we're not paying salaries to those people anymore. Well, who gets that money, that increased efficiency because we're not paying people anymore? Who gets that? Is it the people who own the data and the artificial intelligence algorithms, which is just a few guys sitting today in Silicon Valley, tomorrow in China? And I think that's been a vastly underestimated aspect here. U.S. policies, which are designed to favor U.S. corporations, are actually going to favor Chinese corporations. This free market model, unrestricted flow of data, etc., actually is going to favor some of these big Chinese players more than U.S. players. But it's a fundamental question. Shouldn't the value added come back to me as a citizen because I'm the person who enabled that, and to the community because it's actually the collection of all of our data that does that. My individual data is not worth very much. It's the collection of all that data put together that's worth a lot. So really, we have to go back, I think, to the idea of community ownership, or at least returning the value back to the community, because that really is a public good, all of that data.
What do you think explains this concentration of over-the-top internet companies in the U.S. and China?
Yeah, the computer and telecom businesses have always been a fairly concentrated business. In computers, we've tended to see serial monopolies. You used to have IBM, and then you had the equipment, and now you have Microsoft and Google with Android and so on. Now, the reason for that is because you have two phenomena that kind of are called market failures. One is network externalities. Why do most people use Microsoft Word? Well, because most people use Microsoft Word. It's simpler to just stick to the same product that everybody else is using. The same for the telephone network. Why is there only one telephone network in the world? I mean, there are different operators, right? But they're all interconnected. Well, because there's no benefit in having two separate telephone networks. I want to be able to call anybody. So that's called the positive externality due to network effects. And the other thing is economies of scale. In that business, once you produce something, the cost is in the research and development. And then the cost of actually producing it and shipping it out is very low. So think of Microsoft's business model. It costs them a fair amount of money to develop the new version of, let's say, Word. But then basically it's free to ship it out because they used to send diskettes or CD-ROMs or whatever. Now they don't even do that. You just download it off the internet. And so the marginal cost of production is very low. And so there's a huge economy of scale. So once you get up to a certain level, you become extremely profitable. And then, of course, you use that profit to improve the product, to market it, and so on. And it makes it very difficult for competitors to come in. So those two factors combined have led to traditionally a great deal of concentration, and we're seeing it again. So yeah, China has a separate market, but in the Chinese market, it's very concentrated. And then the rest of the world is very concentrated. What's the alternative to Facebook? LinkedIn? Not really, right? What's the alternative to Google search? Bing? Not really, and so on. Now, what's the solution to that? Well, the traditional solution was traditional antitrust regulation, show that they're harming the consumers, force them to split up, etc. The problem today is that it's not clear they're harming consumers. Maybe they are because the value of the services is less than the value of the data, but that's kind of a hard argument, and nobody knows how to value data these days. So really, we have to have a different thinking, in my view, and say that some things have to be done as public infrastructures. And that's where you create the level playing field and you have competition. So, for example, the basic telecom infrastructure should be viewed as a public infrastructure. That's what the net neutrality debate is about in the US. It's not couched in those terms. That's really what it's about. At what price should people be allowed to use this common infrastructure? And of course, that's not controversial for roads, for water distribution, electrical power distribution, air traffic control. I mean, you name it. There's lots of areas where we say, look, there's kind of a basic level that has to be usable by everybody. It's not necessarily provided by the state, but it's regulated in such a way that everybody has access, and then you compete on top of that layer. And we're only beginning to understand that for the internet. What is the common layer that should be made available to everybody? And again, net neutrality is the beginning of that debate, but maybe that should go higher. Maybe everybody should get email. Why should I have to go to Google to get email? Shouldn't email kind of be a public service? After all, the postal system is a public service, right? I don't have to choose some private vendor in order to go send my letters. I can use DHL or whatever on special delivery, but the basic service is available to everybody at a kind of fixed subsidized cost that's considered affordable for everybody. So maybe we should do the same for email. These are things that need thinking about. But again, there's a blockage of thinking about any of these things because the mantra is, oh no, everything is working just fine. Don't touch it.
As things stand, internet domain names and addresses are privately owned. And so too is the physical backbone of the internet.
That's right. Names and addresses are controlled on the internet by ICANN, which is a private organization. Basically, it's the club of the people who provide those services. Whether it's the IP addresses or the domain names, it's not exactly the same people, so it's not the same club. On the whole, the system has worked reasonably well, although there's some friction in certain areas. What I think is more interesting is the question of the affordable access, because that's not talked about so much. People here in the West don't see it because you don't pay that much for internet access. But if you go to developing countries, you see it's just dramatic. Already they pay more than we do in absolute terms. In some cases, they're paying 50 times as much as we do for the same access in terms of purchasing power. To me, this is shocking. We have basically about 1/3 of the world who is not able to access the internet at anything that people would consider to be affordable prices. Now, why is that? There are two explanations, and unfortunately, we don't have enough data to be able to tell which is true. I think probably both are true to some extent. The explanation of the US and that camp is, well, it's because you still have nasty telecom monopolies in those countries, which are restricting access. So what we need is drop all regulatory barriers, let the free market work, etc. So the other explanation is that, well, at the international level, there's a cartel of very big operators who are routing all the international traffic. The international traffic that's routed, those people actually don't charge each other. They have a free arrangement, interconnect arrangement. It's called peering. So basically, they exchange the data and they exchange such big volumes that they don't measure it and don't charge for it. So it's a barter system. But if you're small and you want to connect to them, they charge you for the full cost of connecting. So basically, developing countries are paying for the full cost of connecting to the internet, including for all of the spam and advertising and all that stuff that they receive, which doesn't necessarily give them much value. And the question is whether that those big operators are acting in some anti-competitive manner. Now, one of the reasons there's no data is because they're not charging prices. As I said, it's a barter system. I send you data, you send me data. Now, think of the airline system. Would you be comfortable with the airline system if you knew that the arrangements between airlines was a barter system, that they didn't actually charge each other? It seems kind of strange, but that's the current setup. And again, the economists who cooperate or work with the U.S. In OECD and elsewhere say, oh no, this is perfect, it's all working fine, etc. Well, the reality is it's not working fine because developing countries pay much too much to connect to the internet. It's not affordable. And then they say, well, yeah, that's true, but that's not because of the international peering system. It's because of these national nasty regulations. We don't know. I personally don't think that's true. I think it's more due to the international setup.
The intellectual property regime and trade agreements are part and parcel of this mantra that monopoly privileges incentivize private sector investment and innovation. Yet the internet was a public, not a private innovation.
Yeah, there are these myths out there that having very strong copyright and very strong patent will favor innovation. Well, the truth is, and there's research on it, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and it depends. But for example, if you take pharmaceuticals, where there's the phenomenon of evergreening, you take a pharmaceutical which was patented. When the patent expires, they make some very minor, insignificant change to the formula, and then they get a new patent, and then it's patented again. This doesn't make any sense, and most observers understand that. So the question of which government measures favor innovations and which ones don't is rather difficult. The internet is an interesting example because there's kind of this myth out there that was created by the private sector. The current thing you see, of course, was created by the private sector, but that's true also of anything else, of telephony or airplanes or whatever. It's all private companies who are actually implementing these services on a large scale. If you look at the origin, it was actually a military project. As most people know, it was originally called the ARPANET. It was a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense in order to connect their computers in order to detect incoming ballistic missiles and that kind of thing. It's a long line of research that started actually before the Second World War, how to use computers to perfect artillery and missiles and those kinds of things. And so out of that military project grew this connection, which was first academic and research centers who were related to the military. And then the idea came to, well, let's see what happens if it goes public. And I think they didn't think that through because some of the key features that you need to go public, such as security, were missing. Internet was originally conceived as a closed, private network, not private in the sense it was not government funded, but private in the sense that it was in a closed environment. So you didn't need security, because you got to trust these research labs. Plus, there were no PCs at the time. It was not a question of connecting individuals. It was a question of connecting what we call servers, fairly big computers that were in secure computer centers. And that's now why we're having all these problems, because you took an insecure network and then allowed it to connect insecure devices. And so now we have this big problem with security that we're trying to fix retroactively.
Talk more about why we have this big security problem.
Yeah, so why do we have this security problem on the internet? Well, basically for market failures. And what are the market failures in security? It's network externalities and information asymmetry. So why do we have an externality with security on the internet? Well, because the insecurity of my PC right here now, when we're talking together, is maybe affecting you. I mean, it's not really because my PC is completely secure, but you don't know that. I could have some virus in my PC now, which is spreading into your computer, and you don't know that. So my lack of security creates a problem for everybody else. This is a typical negative externality. If I pollute the river, it doesn't bother me, but it bothers everybody else downriver. You see that, for example, with the leaks of credit card information. If I'm using an online shopping site and they lose the credit card information, what do I have to do? I have to go to my bank and get a new credit card. Well, the bank doesn't necessarily charge me for that directly, but they do indirectly because there's a cost in replacing the credit card. But the company that lost the credit card data, they don't see that cost. They simply say, oh, oops, we made a mistake. Let's build a new database. So that's another example of an externality. The market failure is because we as consumers can't know what is and is not secure. How do I know that this PC I'm using is sufficiently secure? Yes, I've installed all the patches, the updates, I have antivirus software and so on, but how do I know which antivirus software is better than another one? How can you choose between McAfee and Symantec or Kaspersky or whatever? It's very difficult. So the consumer is unable to evaluate the safety of the product. By the way, that's a standard feature. We've solved it for electrical power because we have underwriter labs and other, government mandated safety standards. We solved it for cars. There's government mandated safety standards. We solved it for airplanes. There's government mandated safety standards. So why do we have this blind spot in an area that's so technical, people cannot possibly know whether the product is safe to use or not, and we don't have any standards on that? This is kind of crazy. People are beginning to understand that it's kind of crazy and it's going to come, but I think it's long overdue. And I'm not the only one saying this, by the way. A lot of security experts agree, and this really should be addressed. And it has to be addressed at the international level, because otherwise it will be a race to the bottom.
We have to leave it there. Richard Hill, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.